Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we're in Montana with a guy who's lived all over the world on a lot of continents, and he raced in the 60s and 70s and after that. But we're going to start talking about the origin story. A two-time All-American, Oklahoma, was home for a while, and he went to Oklahoma State and had some great success there. Welcome on the podcast today, Charlie Boatright.
Thank you.
Let's tell people your origin story. When, where, and how did you get involved in competitive sports and your first running sport?
I was a frustrated bench warmer in basketball. You've seen the movie White Man Can't Jump. So I couldn't jump. I was only 5'10". I wasn't the greatest dribbler either. I would practice hours on end to be able to shoot. And one of my friends in high school talked me into going out for track. He said, "Hey, you don't even have to try out. Everybody who goes out for track makes the team." So that seemed like a pretty low bar. I was in pretty good shape from all the drills that we'd ran in basketball. And the first day I went out, it was mid-season between cross country and track, and the distance runners were still working out and getting ready for track season coming up. And every Friday they would have a time trial, a mile time trial. The day I showed up, they had a mile time trial. There were two sections. I ended up running 5:23, won my section. The track coach, cross country coach, his eyes were bulging. It's like, "Where have you been all my life?" kind of thing. And only one runner that day had a faster time. That year I went on and ran 4:51 as a sophomore.
Let me get the setting here. What city, what size high school?
You're on Oklahoma, which is a military town adjacent to Fort Sill. My dad was still a warrant officer in the U.S. Army, and I was an Army brat. So I was just trying to fit in, like anybody that age, trying to find something to find their identity. And I'd always been a frustrated basketball player because I had uncles on my mom's side of the family that were very successful all-state basketball players in the state of Arkansas. So I wanted to emulate them, but it didn't have the skills to make it in basketball. But I had a lot of heart, and so I would go all out in workouts. And I was the kind of basketball player. Coach would send me in with the last minute or two. So I was just frustrated. I wanted to participate more than anything. I go out for track, and immediately I found my niche.
What year was that?
I graduated from high school in 69, so the fall of 66, 67.
I actually taught some courses out at Fort Sill. What I remember, I was a pretty flat place.
It's very flat. You can see for miles, and everything in Oklahoma is marked off in section miles. And that's how I would keep track of how far I was running. If I just go from one intersection to the next, I knew that I'd covered a mile. And I didn't really know anything about distance running or training or anything. This was back in the era, what they called long, slow distance. The farther you could go, the better aerobic capacity you could develop. That was my training philosophy.
What'd you run that mile in?
I ran that mile in high top Converse tennis shoes, and I was slipping and sliding all over the place. So the fact that I ran that fast was probably pretty amazing. But I did later get tracked some decent running shoes.
Did they have a dedicated cinder track there?
Yeah, it was a dedicated cinder track. It was before the days of all-weather tracks. There were hardly any all-weather tracks in the state of Oklahoma at that time in the late 60s.
And you had moved around. How long were you in Oklahoma? And let's blitz through some of the other places you lived around the world as an Army brat kind of kid.
I was born in Arkansas. Both my parents were farmers. I grew up going to the farm every summer to visit my grandparents' 160-acre farm. I was born in Berryville, Arkansas, a tiny little town, about 2,000 population. I was born in 1951. I'd lived in Formosa, Taiwan, 2 years between 1956 and 1958. Then my dad got transferred to Stuttgart, Germany in 1958 to 62. Between the ages of 8 and 12, I lived in Germany. I was not into sports other than I played baseball like a lot of kids, but I was coach one time told my dad, he said he would do a lot better hitting if he would open his eyes, but he closes his eyes every time the pitcher throws the ball. So I was afraid of getting hit. So I was not going to be destined to be a Mickey Mantle or anything like that. We lived in Texas, San Antonio, Texas for a while, finished my elementary years and first year of middle school. Then my dad got transferred to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and then a year later to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So we moved to Lawton, Oklahoma in 1966. And I lived there until I graduated from high school in 1969 and then went on to school at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Let's talk about your high school career. In sophomore year, you got involved as a running athlete. What was your learning and what did your coach know about?
Well, was
training?
the most pivotal thing that happened to me. The head coach, he had a conversation with me at the end of my sophomore year. My best times as a sophomore in track were 4:51 in the mile. I ran 2:06 or 2:07 in 880. Our school record was pretty decent. Our school record holder in the distance events was an individual who ended up running the 1968 Olympics by the name of Willie Rios. And he held the school record of 4:17 and 9:20 something in the 2 mile. But he said, if you want to be the kind of runner that Willie was, and he said, this is what he would do different than most high school runners. He would run between seasons. Because back then in that day, it was not very common. When the season was over after the state meet or conference meet, however far you made it, that was the end of your season until cross country season. And nobody ran in the summertime. So he challenged me to run 10 miles a day during the summertime when it's not enough. You can't have organized official workouts in high school because of the rules. But he said, you got to do this on your own. So I took the challenge and I said, I think I could do that. I started off running a mile. I'd go out to this dirt road that was next to my house, and it was along the military base, Fort Sill. And I'd run along, and I started off running 1 telephone pole and walk, 2 telephone poles and walk, 3 telephone poles walk, and basically a modified, almost like interval type session. And I built up to where I could run. At that time, it was a challenge just to see how far I could go. And so I did that. I ran that 10 miles a day that whole summer. And I came back after being a 4:51 miler and a 2:08 half miler that season in cross country. I ended up finishing 7th in the state in cross country. And in my junior year, that following track season, I ended up winning the state 2 mile and ran 9:41. And I was undefeated that year. So that was the beginning of the idea that maybe I stumbled onto something that I was good at.
Did you have any teammates that were at your caliber?
No. Matter of fact, my coach, my senior year, he would let me go train on my own. I didn't even have to go to the track workouts because my training primarily composed of running long distance. I worked up to where I could run 5 days a week, running 20 miles a day. So I was running 80 to 100 miles a week as a junior in high school. And so I had tremendous aerobic capacity, and my strategy was very simple. I would just go out as hard as I could and dare anyone to keep up with me. And it was not uncommon for me, not understanding pacing that at that time in my career. I would go out sometimes in an 8-lap 2 mile. I would run 60 to 62 seconds of opening quarter and then just go into a aerobic cruise control. And else I would be 50 to 100 yards ahead of everybody else. Nobody could ever catch me. So
what was the status of running there in Oklahoma there at the end of the 60s? Did local papers cover it? Did the school think of it anything compared to baseball, football?
Yeah, no, I got good coverage because of the fact that I was winning. I got a lot of coverage in high school because of that. I'd get interviewed, not only the high school newspapers, but the local newspaper sports editors, stuff like that, because they like to follow. Track was very popular in Oklahoma because for the most part, not so much distance running. Distance running was, we used to joke the fact that whenever they would have the 2 mile run, that's when everybody would go to the bathroom or go get a drink or something like that. Nobody would stay and actually watch 8 laps of somebody running because it was so boring. Oh my gosh, there's nothing happening. It's a very football centric sports community. So everything was about football. So if you didn't have anything to do with football, they really didn't pay much attention to you. And then the year that I won the state meet for the first time, ran 9:41, our high school, which was a fairly new high school, had only been in existence for about 4 or 5 years. We won the state championship. So we were the first state champions in our school for any sport for that matter. And so we got a lot of notoriety because of that, because we won the state championships.
Who else scored points? What other track athletes were there?
That was post integration. We had blacks on our team. And so we had probably 5 or 6 black athletes that were very talented sprinters and hurdlers and pole vaulters. And those were our scoring events. And then there was me. So the coach knew that he'd get 10 points for the 2 mile. And then he'd get points in the 100, the 200, the 440 relay. And then we had a sprinter that was also a good, one of our best sprinters was 120-yard high hurdles. So that's where we got our points. We had a couple white guys that could pole vault and one white guy that scored in the high jump, and that was it. I was the only runner over 400 meters that scored points. And they had the rule you couldn't double in the mile and the 2 mile because they thought that was too much. So they restricted you. You could double in the 880 in the mile, but in Oklahoma at that time, you could not double the mile and the 2 mile. So I had to choose one or the other. So I was a better distance runner than I was a miler. My fastest time in high school was I ran 426 in the mile my senior year.
When did you get noticed by colleges and get recruiting?
Well, I started getting recruited after I won the state meet my junior year. And I got letters from several different colleges, not out of state, pretty much University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State were the only schools that were actively recruiting me. And I actually wanted to go to Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma. They had actively recruited me and sent me letters and all that kind of stuff throughout the whole year. And I thought that for sure was where I was going to go. Then my senior year, I ended up getting beat in the 2 mile. I was a defending champion, ended up getting beat by a guy, Gene Horton. And he was a junior. He was a year younger than me. He stayed right on my heels the whole way until the last 200 and just blasted. And I ended up fading badly. And I ended up running the same times I did the year before, but he ended up running 9:23 and I ran 9:41. So after losing that race my senior year, Oklahoma ignored me and they went after other guys. And then last minute, I get a call from Oklahoma State University, asking me to come up for a school visit. And that's how I ended up going to Oklahoma State. Fortuitously for me, it was probably the best 4 years of my life running wise. And I didn't know at the time when I was being recruited by them. My coach was a former Olympian, Tom Von Ruden, who was an OSU alumni. And he was my coach for 3 out of the 4 years that I ran Oklahoma State. I was glad in God's providence that I ended up going to Oklahoma State rather than OU.
What kind of student were you in high school?
I was a solid A-, B+ student. I was looking back at my old ACT test scores. I was going through some files last night and I scored 23 on the ACT test. I was probably a solid B student. I was never an A student, but I was a college prep. When you were a sophomore in high school, you had to declare you're either going to be college prep or you're going to go into industrial arts or something like that. So I chose college prep, which meant that you had to take foreign language and that class advanced math and stuff like that. Mainly, I was not an academic guy per se in that point in my life because I had moved around so much and neither of my parents had graduated from college. So I didn't really have the background to really understand the importance of academic preparation. I went on after I graduated from Oklahoma State. I was a much better grad student than I ever was in undergrad. In undergrad, I graduated, I think, with about a 2.3 grade point average, barely making it. But if you understand anything about college athletics, it's like having a full-time job. Training 80 to 100 miles a week takes a lot out of you. We would typically come in from a workout and we'd be exhausted. We'd go and eat. Back then, you didn't have a choice. You had to live in an athletic dorm. So I lived in the Iva Hall, which was the athletic dorm at Oklahoma State. So all our food was taken care of by our scholarship. But you'd come up after eating dinner and you'd fall asleep on your bed and set your alarm for about 9 o'clock and get up and then study.
Yeah.
You'd be just exhausted from the severity of the workouts.
I want to talk a little bit more about high school then. How did you handle losing as defending champ? How psychologically did that get into your psyche? And you had your strategy of being a front runner of, I'm just going as hard as I can, see if you can catch me. What about your competitive drive? Basketball in the rear window now,
Right.
and you become really successful. So how does that affect your ego as a teenager and then losing?
I loved the attention that I got when I started winning. I never lost a race until my last race of my high school career. That was the only race I ever lost.
Wow.
If anything, I was addicted to winning and I loved it. And that motivated me. They always say fear is probably one of your greatest motivations. And fear of losing probably motivated me to train harder and to make sure that I didn't take winning for granted. But I knew people were always out to beat me. I had the target on my back. But for me, being a competitive individual, wanting to win and enjoying the rewards of winning, the funny thing is, like a lot of high school runners, I went out for track the first time before I ever had any success. All I wanted to do was to get a letter jacket. I wanted to letter because I thought that would impress the girls and help me get a girlfriend up. And I got the letter jacket, but I never did get the girlfriend. But anyway, and I was very shy in high school socially. I could talk to girls. I had lots of girls that were my best friends, but I could never get up the nerve to ask them out. So I never dated one time in high school. I didn't start dating until I was in college.
Yeah, that probably didn't hurt
Yeah.
brains.
Having the reduced social life probably helped me to focus more on running. But in answer to your question, I was very competitive. I wanted to win, and that drive made me work harder to make sure that I was in a position where I could always have the advantage of being able to dictate the pace. There were times I remember one time ran a really crazy race, probably one of the craziest pace races I ever ran. I ran a 4:36 mile. And to give you an idea, I ran the first lap in 60 seconds and I ran the last lap in 60 seconds, but I ended up running 4:36. So I ran
6 in the middle. Oh my God.
almost 80-second laps in the middle and then 60 seconds bracketed on each side. When you're young, you don't know any better. And then you start reading. That's when I started reading track and field news. And I was the same class, same age as Steve Prefontaine. He was the hero. If you wanted to be a successful distance runner, you aspired to be like Pre. Then I eventually ran against him. First time I ran against him was my sophomore year in college at National NCAA Cross Country Championships. And that was back east in William and Mary College, my sophomore year.
Let me ask you about the transition to college. Sounds apart from, okay, you're going to live away from home on your own. You're going to have teammates. And
Right.
you're going to have a coach that knows running. What was all that transition like?
It was like going from the proverbial being a big fish in a little pond to being a little fish in a big pond. And so there was definitely a transition. My coach, and I didn't get introduced to him until my freshman year when I showed up on campus at Oklahoma State. Tom Von Ruden was an Olympian who ran on the 1968 Olympic team. He came in 9th place. He was a 3:56 miler at that time when he ran at Oklahoma State. And he was a world record holder in the 800 meters and 880. I think he ran 880, one NCAA 1 year indoors. And so he was a prolific middle distance runner. He didn't run too many cross country and 3 miles. That was not his specialty. And I don't think he ever ran a marathon, but he was world class in 800 through 1500 meters. Coming into that environment, it was a very competitive environment. I had 2 teammates that were sub 4 milers. And so I go from a 4:26 miler to now I'm training every day with sub 4 milers. It was literally baptism by fire, being thrown into the deep end of the pool. So every day was a test. And probably because of my competitive nature, I wasn't going to throw in the towel and give up. So I was very competitive. Matter of fact, I broke the school record in cross country as a freshman. I was the first freshman to ever break 20 minutes for 4 miles. When I did that, I was the 4th guy on my team. And so I just ran with these other 3 guys and just wouldn't relent, wouldn't give up. I just hung on to their heels as best I could. And so that developed within me a whole different style of running because I used to being the one that dictated the pace. Now I'm trying my best to hold on for dear life. And so I did that. I didn't have the speed and the endurance that I later developed after my first 2 years of college. Matter of fact, it's very frustrating as a freshman and sophomore when you go into college ranks, because if you don't have the national rankings or skills that, say, a C. Prefontaine had, you don't get to go to any meets because you have to qualify. So I didn't have any qualifying times, even though I ran 4:17 in the mile and 14 something in the 3 mile. Those times were not fast enough to get you into the big meets like Drake relays or Kansas relays. So the only races I got to race were dual and triangular meets and conference meets. So I would stay home and until I raced myself into condition where I could be ranked to be able to qualify. So the first 2 years were frustrating.
Let me ask you one about freshman year. You were right at the cusp. Freshman, were you allowed to compete?
Oh yeah, no, that was after they passed the rule where they didn't have the Frosh only teams. When I started in the fall of 1969, they had changed that rule, I think the year before, where you only could compete against other freshmen. So the year that I started running as a freshman, I was on the varsity, cross country, as well as track teams. And then the other thing I mentioned was when I got to track, I just didn't get to go to all the meets that the other guys did because I didn't have any qualifying times. So
let's jump into this first race where you ran out east against Prefontaine. What do you remember about being in a big meet like that where you're probably not going to pace setter?
It was my first national competition. Certainly the Big 8 conference was very competitive. We were in the same conference as Kansas University. I had already had the distinction of being able to, even as a sophomore, I ran in a dual meet against University of Kansas in cross country, and I actually beat Jim Ryun, but it was over 6 miles. I don't know if you count that as a defeat, but
if I beat him, I'd count it.
But yeah, I beat Jim Ryun in a 6-mile cross country race at KU, and we upset them. Oklahoma State, they were a favored team, but we upset them and beat them in a dual meet. And that was probably one of the happiest days of my coach's life experience when we upset KU. But answering your question about the nationals, I was prepared to run at a high quality rate. And back then, you didn't run 6 miles or 10K until you got to national level. Most of all your cross country meets in college were 4 miles. So I was used to running sub 5-minute mile pace for 4 miles all through my freshman and sophomore years. So my sophomore year was the first year I had the experience of running to nationals. It was back in William and Mary College. I think it was a sponsoring college. It was run out on a remote location. I think it was Plantation. They had laid out a course. It was 10,000 meters. I'd only run a 10,000 race one time that season. So that was going to be a huge challenge, just going from 4 miles racing to 6 miles racing. But I remember the start, and the start in cross country is the most important part. And we'd been trained and certainly getting used to going out it was not uncommon to run 60 seconds for your first 400 meters. And so you had to be prepared to do that and not go into such anaerobic threshold that you ended up just dying and couldn't continue running. So I was used to that. But still, what I was not used to was running with 365 runners at the start. And it was a wooded course, but the start was out in the open, flat, and you had to get to this certain point in the race course. I think it was about a quarter mile away. If you didn't get near the front, you were going to be stuck in a caravan of runners throughout the whole race. And it was a sandy course. I remember that. And it was very difficult to pass. So I just remember being overwhelmed. I remember seeing University of Oregon warming up and seeing Prefontaine from a distance. Obviously, I'd never met him, didn't know him. He wouldn't have known me, but he was the guy. And there, Donald Walsh from Villanova was a big runner, and several other guys. He was the guy to go for. And it was crazy race. I ended up running pretty close to my times I'd run all season, but instead of finishing in the top 10 or top 20 of the race, I'm back in 100. I think I ended up finishing 107th place out of 365 runners. So I was in the top third of the race. That was my sort of baptism into national competition. And that was how I got started. But I wanted to compete. And so I went out and stuck it as far as I could. But I didn't have the ability to run at 6 miles the way I did at 4 miles. So I wasn't prepared. That was probably the biggest challenge and understanding was that there's a huge difference between racing at 4 miles versus 6 miles.
At the end of that race, finishing just out of the top 100, when did you set goals and think All-American was possible?
That was something that my coach and I, Tom Von Ruden, had set as a goal at the end of my sophomore year. I'd run 4:17 in the mile, and I ran 14:04 in the 3 mile. So we sat down at the end of the track season, and he was the one that put the idea in my mind. I would have never set a goal that high. He said, Charlie, I really think that you're All-American potential. And he said, this is what you're going to have to do. Similar to the motivational speech I got from my high school coach saying you're going to have to run 10 miles a day during the summer. He just said, you're going to have to be consistent in your training throughout this whole summer after you go home for the holidays or the summer vacation. And he said, you need to have a goal. And he says, I really think you should set as your goal to be an All-American next year in cross country. And so even during his international running, he was training himself to try to be a repeat member of the 1972 Olympic team in the 1500 meters. That he was all about racing and setting goals for himself. So that was his goal. So he wanted me to be prepared for that and have a mental goal as well as a physical goal of what I was shooting for. So he sent me postcards from Europe when he was running in meets over there. And just a reminder, remember top 25. And one of the things he had always used to do this throughout my whole running career with him is like one of the goals I had for myself, because at that time I had, as a sophomore, my mile times were not nearly as fast as they ended up running as a junior. So my goal was to try to maybe qualify for the Olympics trials in the steeplechase. So he'd say, I wonder what Sid Sink's doing today, or I wonder what Steve Prefontaine's doing today. So that was his motivational head games. He'd play with me to try to get me to motivate myself to go out there and do what it's easier to stay home and kick back or go to the lake and have fun floating around on an inner tube like that in the summer rather than going out and running 10 miles in the blazing heat of Oklahoma summers. So that was when the goal was set to become an All-American, was in the summer before.
What would you do in the summer after your sophomore year apart from running?
My parents had moved from Lawton, Oklahoma at that time. My dad, he had retired for the military, but he had a business opportunity, and my family up and moved to Amarillo, Texas. So I decided, because a lot of times when you're in track as a competitive athlete, particularly in a Division I school, it's very tough academically to keep up. So I needed to take some summer school classes. So that summer, I ended up taking a couple of business law classes and another class from, at that time, it was West Texas State University in Amarillo in Canyon, Texas. So I would run, and it was similar to Oklahoma. It was very flat there, but it was higher elevation. So I don't know if that helped me in my preparation for that cross-country season, but because it's about 4,000 elevation, even though it's flat as a pancake in Amarillo, Texas. That was my training was basically duplicating the same thing I'd done when I was in high school. I went back and looked at my log last night. I averaged about 60 miles a week during the summer, and mostly distance. I didn't do any track work at all.
Yeah. Okay. What happened that season in terms of the progression there? And it sounds like you thought, okay, All-American, it's in your mind. That's what you're going to get. But what did you do for racing success that season?
Well, what was different my junior year when it came back was the guys who were the sub-4 milers that I was chasing my freshman and sophomore years, they had all graduated. Guys like Larry Rose, who was a 359 miler, guys like George Stewart, who was a 403 miler and ran 1330 in 3 mile and 5K, and Peter Call, who finished second in the AU 1500 meters one year. He was a 401 miler in high school from South Africa. So those are the guys that I chased my freshman and sophomore years. I think in a way, they prepared me for my big breakthrough that I had as a junior, because I was always chasing after them in workouts. I never led workouts my freshman and sophomore year. So that was a difference from high school to college. I was the one that would lead the workouts, or most in high school when I would do 20-mile runs, there was nobody that went with me. I was running by myself. In college, my first 2 years, I'm chasing these guys who are national level sub-4 minute milers. And now as a junior, they've all graduated and gone on. Now, Tom Von Ruden was still there, and he's training for the 72 games the following year. And Johnny Haberset was a transfer from South Africa, and he was a national class runner, but he was not eligible to run my junior year. So he would train with us, but he was a red shirt. He couldn't compete until after he'd set out a certain amount of time from transferring. I think because he came from South Africa, he had to set out a whole year before he's eligible. So I had all these guys to work out with, but when it got to races, I was the front guy. Matter of fact, my junior year in cross country, I went undefeated. I didn't lose any cross country races until the conference meet. In the conference meet, I made the mistake of being too conservative, partly because the one guy I was most fearful of was Jerome Howell, and he was a sub 4-minute miler, and he'd already been All-American in cross country. So I knew he was formidable. He went out pretty hard. I hung back. It was a very cold and hilly course in Lincoln, Nebraska. Nebraska's flat as a state. They had a really hilly course. And I went out very slow and conservative, and I was quite a ways back. I was probably back in 10th place at the 2-mile mark. And so I had a lot of ground to make up, but I ended up finishing third at the conference meet. So that was my first defeat. That was a reality check, I think, but I think it helped prepare me more so for the national competition, which was 2 weeks later in Knoxville, Tennessee, which was also a very hilly course. That time I made sure that I had a different strategy, because one thing you learn when the faster competition you go, you learn very quickly that if you get too much distance between yourself and the front pack, no matter how good you are, you're not going to make up that kind of distance. So the key is to push yourself fast the first part of the race to stay within contact, but not go so fast that you're completely blown out aerobically and you have nothing left in the gas tank, so to speak. Pacing is critical, particularly the faster you get.
You talked about your 60-mile weeks in the summer. Not a lot of mileage. It's less than you had run in high school. What about injuries? Through the start of your junior year cross country, had you gotten any injuries up till then?
I was very fortunate. I'd never really had any. I had teammates that had stress fracture injuries and ankle or knee injuries. I'd never had anything like that. Probably the most severe injury I ever had when I was in college, and even in high school for that matter, were shin splints. And a lot of that had to do with just poor shoes. We just didn't have the kind of shoes back then. When I would go out and do 20-mile runs, I was running in real thin sole shoes. Eventually, I think by my junior year in high school, I had a pair of Adidas cross countries, and they were pretty solid shoes to run in. But prior to that, I didn't. But I think in terms of injury, I was very fortunate in that respect. But I remember a lot of it had to do with Tom von Ruden was one, because he was always adverse to getting injuries himself. We did as much of our training as possible on the red clay dirt roads of surrounding Stillwater OSU campus. And we did not run on roads that much, asphalt roads. Only one time did we ever go. I remember we drove over to Tulsa and we ran a 10K road race. And that was the only experience I had of running 10K prior to the nationals. And that was the only reason he had us run it. He wanted us to experience what it was like to run sub 5-minute mile pace for 6 miles versus 4 miles. He had an aversion to running on hard surfaces. So if we were running down that was really hard, like an asphalt road, he would say, run off the road on the grass. So we would do that to avoid injuring ourselves. But I was in that respect, I never had any injuries.
Oh, that's neat. So when you're running there training in the red, are your socks turned red and you're watching prairie dogs pop up? That's what I remember from Fort Saul.
Oh yeah. It was very boring. It was not scenic. Not like it is running in Montana here. I go here, it's very scenic.
Let's talk about the race. Let's talk about nationals, where you, after winning until conference meet, and then you had the experience of 350 people start. How'd that race go?
I knew what to expect in terms of the start because I'd run the year before at the nationals. So I think that immensely helped, because without that experience, you're lost. It's a big change from going from a conference race or invitational race to a national race where you've got 350 runners vying for the same start gate area. I knew it was important, vitally important. It was a cold day. It was 23 degrees, which was not uncommon for that time of the year. It's November and it's in Tennessee. I remember warming up. I remember seeing all the guys I looked up to, Prefontaine. I remember seeing other guys, obviously Jerome Howell, I saw him, and all the other guys. I'd not met Dave Wottle, but he was in the race. There was other guys from Villanova. I ended up finishing ahead of Marty Liquori. Marty Liquori was in the race. I beat him that day. Natl Wall.
She said Sank. Did you see said Sank before the race? Was he?
Sank had already graduated.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He graduated the year before. So Wottle, he had a team. He ran, Bowling Green ran a whole team there. but Wottle was the only one that I knew of in terms of by name. Yeah, Sinkin graduated.
How'd the start go?
It was run on a golf course, but the golf course and obviously, if you know anything about Knoxville, it's a very hilly terrain. And so the first mile, it was they had picked a spot on one of the probably two adjoining holes on the golf course where they could get 400 yards wide, where they could get 300 and some guys lined up a chalk line, and then they fired the gun. And then it was like a herd of buffalo. It was intimidating, the noise and just the excitement and the adrenaline rush. Everything's on the line. You don't get a second chance. I'm going out really fast, but I was very cautious about going out too fast. So I remember, since my goal was to finish in the top 25, because that's what gets you All-American status, and I was running as an individual, our team did not qualify. So what was funny was I ended up flying back to Knoxville from Stillwater by myself. The school made all the arrangements for hotel and flights and all that kind of stuff. But I wasn't traveling with anybody. So I was totally by myself, nobody. But what was providential, I think, in the sense that it was an encouragement to me, was I ran into the University of Colorado team and coach. I'll never forget, I knew him very well, Jerry Queller, and I had several friends on the Colorado team, including Ted Castaneda and some of these guys. And that was before Ted had become into national prominence as an international ranked distance runner. Tim Cronin was one of the guys in the team, and a bunch of other guys. So I'd always got along really well with several of the guys in the University of Colorado team. So they invited me the night before the race to go to a movie with them. And of all movies, we went and saw, it was one of these horror thriller types. It was called Play Misty for Me. And if you know anything about the movie, it's one of these thrasher killer knife movies where you're on oh my gosh, you're just adrenaline. I don't know if that was a good preparation or not. It scared me to death, but maybe it helped me go to sleep easier. But I was there. And only reason I mentioned that is because Jerry Queller was the only guy there who acted as a coach for me. And throughout the whole course, the course was a 3-mile loop that you ran twice. And Jerry kept yelling at me. I remember after we went out, the first mile of the race was pretty much uphill. And I remember I was probably back in about 30th or so place, or 35th place. So I'm near the front. I'm ahead of the bulk of the pack behind me. There's probably over 300 guys behind me, but there's still about 50 people or less in front of me. And I remember going through the mile marker, and I remember hearing 423, 424, 425. So those guys, Prefontaine and Bjorklund, who I never met or anything, but I'd run against them the year before, they had to have gone through in 418, 419, under 420 for the first mile. So we're moving and uphill. And so that's where you see that picture that's posted, that's at the 1 mile marker. And so I'm back in that pack, probably about 30th or 35th place. But I'll never forget Jerry Queller. He stationed himself on the course, a couple different places. And he kept yelling at me. And he said, "Charlie, you're in 30th place. You keep it up." And then when I got farther along, I think by the time I worked my way around after the first lap, I was in about 25th place. He said, "Charlie, you're in 25th place. Keep it up. You're doing great." So my strategy was just through attrition, because in any cross country race, you have those that go out too fast and they may pick up the pace and race on to win. And then you have those that went out too fast that start dropping. And so what happens after the first 3-mile loop, that's when I started realizing I had a real chance, because I knew my position, even though I couldn't count them because they were farther ahead. By the end of the race, Prefontaine was like 54 seconds in front of me. He ran, I think, 29:14. I ended up running 30:07 or 30:04. I can't remember exactly, but I was a good 50 seconds or so behind him. But throughout that whole second lap, Jerry Queller, the Colorado coach, kept telling me my position.
Hi. So now you, halfway through, you thought, okay, this is working.
It seems surreal, because it's one thing to have a goal. It's something else to be prepared to know that you can run in the company of these kind of runners, but to actually pull it off it seemed reachable, but it seemed unobtainable at the same time because I'd never been there. I'd never run in the company of those runners at that level, at the nationals. I'd run against those. Like I said, I came in third place behind Jerome Howe, who was a sub 4-minute miler and went on to finish fourth that year in the 1500 meters Olympic trials. So I was used to running with guys like that, but to be at the nationals was a whole nother story. So at the 3-mile mark, it began to seem possible. And as each mile went by, it got more and more real. But at this point, I'm not accelerating, but it felt like I was accelerating. I'm probably just maintaining the same pace the whole way, which is if you know anything about distance running, that's the best, most efficient way to run your best times is to run an even pace, not to go real fast and real slow and then try to catch up and you're too far back. At the 4-mile mark is when Dave Wottle passes me. And so I know him, I recognize him with his hat on and everything. I'm going, I got to stick with this guy. And so I just hang on to him for all dear life. And we're just passing guys right and left. I have no idea how far I am up the pace until I cross the finish line, 1 second behind Dave Wottle. And Jerome Howe ended up finishing. I never saw him. He was ahead of me the whole way. He ended up finishing 10th and I was 13th. But I get the little popsicle stick and it says 13th place. So I was like, unbelievable. It was like I was in a surreal kind of experience and I can't believe I did this. So,
well, that's an interesting position to be in. You were part of the team scoring that year. Next year, you guys qualified, right?
Yeah.
As a team. And then, so what's it like? You get the stick and you're just like, you're right behind Waddle and it's 13. There's nobody to really go and hug unless you can find your Colorado buddies.
The Colorado buddies came up afterwards and congratulated, Jerry Queller in particular, congratulated me and everything. But the reality of it didn't sink in until we went to the awards ceremony. The awards ceremony was actually in a clubhouse. It wasn't outside. Like a lot of times you see now, you watch them on TV, they have the awards ceremony right there. They just put a platform out and everybody comes up and stands on. This was actually different. Maybe they just didn't have it set up that way back then. But it was inside one of the rooms in the clubhouse of the golf course. And I sat on the same row as University of Oregon. The main reason I did that was because I knew personally one of the guys on the team, because he was a friend of one of my teammates who did not go to the meet, a race, Reed Harder, who was from California, but he was a friend of one of the runners on University of Oregon team called Mike Long. So I sat next to Mike Long and Prefontaine was like 3 people down. So he got up and Mike introduced me to Steve Prefontaine, and that's where I got to meet him personally for the first time. But that's when the reality hit that and you got to go, they call your name and you go up and they give you the award and everything and the certificate, they mailed you that later. But it was surreal. Now all of a sudden you feel like you belong. I'm in the company of these people because I finished in this place.
So you have track and a year left, and it's going to be a coaching change. What was your goal setting after that?
My goal at that time, after finishing an All-American, coming back, it was almost like surreal. Like you said, I didn't have any teammates or coach or anything to congratulate me on my success or anything. So it was almost like when I flew back by myself and flew back to the Tulsa airport and got in my Volkswagen to drive back to Stillwater, which was like an hour-and-a-half drive. I was by myself. There was nobody to converse with, nobody to talk to. This is before the days of cell phone. So there was no cell phone to say, hey, let me tell you what it was like. You know, it was radio silence, literally, from the time I left Knoxville with my awards and everything and got back to Stillwater. The next morning was when it hit because all my teammates come knocking on my door, my dorm room door. They burst open the door, come piling in on top of me and everything and congratulating me. And they were blown away, I think. And even though they knew that obviously I was a talented runner, nobody thought I was going to finish 13th. I mean, nobody. And not even Von Ruden. He was like blown away because it's like, we set this goal to finish in the top 25, but blew way past 25th place, ended up in 13th. So that was what was amazing. But after that, my goal at that time was to try to run a qualifying time to get the Olympic trials. One of the things that was probably the most helpful to me was right after that, my teammate that I mentioned earlier, Reed Harder, was from California, and he was from Santa Monica, California. So he invited me to go home with him over the Christmas holidays. So shortly after the NCAAs, which is right before Thanksgiving, like a month later, after finals and everything at Oklahoma State, I got in my Volkswagen Bug, and with my parents' permission, I drove from Oklahoma all the way to California and spent a whole month in California training. And it was a great experience. I would run up and down San Vicente Boulevard. If you've ever been to Santa Monica, it's a great place to train. All grass median from the shore of the Pacific Ocean all the way up to close to where UCLA campus is. So I'm doing that the whole time. My best mile time prior to that cross country season was, like I said, 4:17 the year before. So I ran a all-comers meet in San Bernardino. I ended up winning it. I ran 4:15. So I'm feeling like, man, I'm getting faster. Not only am I a good endurance runner, but I've got some speed. Then 2 weeks later, I ran in another all-comers meet, and this one was at Long Beach, and it was an all-surface track. And I'm running against runners from USC and Long Beach State, stuff like that. I ended up coming in second. And the guy from USC ran 4:08 and I ran 4:10. So now I've dropped my PR from 4:17 to 4:10. And who knows what the future is. So I come back and my coach was able to get me into Albuquerque Indoor Invitational. I'm running against international class runners. I'm running against George Young and also the runner from Australia, world record holder in the 2 mile.
Clark. Yeah.
I'm running against Ron Clark and George Young in a 2 mile indoor. Now it's in Albuquerque and it's at altitude. So I go out with them and I'm running there. And if you know anything about indoor running, particularly at altitude, it's all about slow pace sprint. And so you just trying to stay in position. It was a packed field. And I went out the first mile in 4:30, which at altitude was pretty intense. And then I trip. I ended up tripping and falling, going down on my hands and knees. I sprinted in my feet as fast as I could to try to catch up, but the race is pretty much over for me. I ended up running 9:34. So I ran 4:30 my first mile, which would have been 9-minute pace if I'd have kept the same pace, but ended up running 9:34. So I died, but it was a good experience for me. It was frustrating, but it taught me something about indoor running is different than cross country. You got to protect your position. You got to be more mindful. So 2 weeks later, my coaches got me entered in Oklahoma City indoor meet. I'm running the 2 mile again. This time I'm running against Johnny Haberstedt, who had already run 8:35 in the 2 mile the year before. And so he's formidable. I'm not going to beat him, but I'm going to be competitive as I can. This is a 10 lap wood bank surface track. We go to the first mile in 4:30. And then we ended up coming through. So I'm thinking, well, that's pretty decent because that's the same pace I ran at altitude at Albuquerque. I ended up being in following through the 3/4 mile. I ended up coming through in 6:45. Now, this time I realized that's the same pace. I'm going to get smoked. So I take off in a sprint the last half mile. And Haberstedt catches me on the last half lap and slings past me. He ends up running 8:49. I end up running 8:51. So this is my PR. I had run that previous cross country season. I forgot to mention this before. This is where it told me that I was ready for a breakthrough in cross country at the nationals. Is I had run an 8:55 time trial on the track like 3 weeks before the nationals. So I knew I was capable of running fast times, but I wasn't prepared for it. Now all of a sudden, now it's becoming regular. I'm competitive. I'm vying for the race. Even though Haberstedt, my teammate, beat me, I'm still ecstatic because I run 8:51, which is a PR. What happened the next couple of weeks was more mind-boggling. We ended up getting entered as a distance medley relay in Fort Worth indoor. And Tom Von Ruden is entered in the mile. He ends up running the mile. I run my PR best. I ran the 13:20 leg on the distance medley relay. We ended up winning the race. And I ran the first leg, which is the 13:20. I run a PR 2:59. So Von Ruden comes up to me after my race and says, "Would you like to be a rabbit for me?" And his race was like an hour later at the end of the meet. The distance medley relay was at the beginning of the meet. So I only have an hour's time from running 2:59. And I come back and I ended up running a 1:50 because he only wants me to run half mile. And I ended up getting in the race. And The funny story about it is he's racing against Leonard Hilton. And Leonard Hilton, who was an outstanding miler and 3-miler from the University of Houston, he's thinking that he'd watch me run that 259. So he's thinking he's going to run the same distance. I pulled off the track after the end of 800. Leonard Hilton is stuck right behind me. He's now in the lead. Claude Ryun just sets on his heels until the last lap and then just takes off and ends up running 3:57 to win the race. But Leonard Hilton was mad at me because he's sabotaged him and set him up for getting smoked by Von Ruden at the end. So here I've run 2:59, 8:51, PRs every time I go out, it seems like. Now my coach entered me in the mile race at the Astrodome, University down in Houston, Texas. I don't know if you know anything about that particular race or event. They no longer have it, but at the time, it was one of the largest indoor tracks. It was a fifth of a mile, wood banked. You're talking much faster than even the current 200-meter bank tracks they have today. It was almost like running outdoors, but it was a wooden bank track. You had to run prelims to get to the finals. So I ran prelims, and I'm running against someone who I'd never heard of before, but he ended up being a pretty national world-class runner later on. Paul Cummings, he's a freshman running unattached. At that time, I think he wasn't eligible. They didn't have the freshman rule, but I think he was running redshirted as a freshman. And so he just ran with the BYU shirt on, but it wasn't official logo. So I ran a 4:04 in the prelims against Paul Cummings, right? He ran 4:04.5. I ran 4:04.7. 6 hours later, I have to run the finals. And I ended up running against my nemesis, Dave Wottle, again. Dave ends up winning in a strategy type race. He ends up winning in 4:03.7. I come in fourth place in 4:06. So I ran a 4:04 PR and doubled back with a 4:06 6 hours later in the finals. So now I'm thinking, I've got the world by the tail. But then reality sits in and you realize as time goes on, you can't keep making PR improvements to this degree. Later on that year, I ended up going to the Big 8 indoors. I ended up running 9:01, finishing fifth place. I was very disappointed in that race. Haberstead wins that. It was a fast strategic race where it was based upon kick. So I was never really much of a kicker. I was one that always did really well at just going out at a fast pace and holding on. That was probably my downfall as a miler. I just didn't have that kind of a kick, at least to the degree that they did. When I ran 4:04 in the mile, I ran 3:06 through 3/4 and then ran 57 seconds the last quarter to drop it down. So I had good closing speed. I used to tell people, like when I ran against Dave Wottle, when he ran 4:03 and I ran 4:06, he just had a gear I didn't have. I'd be with him and then he would just pull away. But I didn't have that kind of blazing. I didn't have 800 speed like he had. So that was the thing. You notice right away, there's fast and then there's really fast.
So what event were you targeting?
I was targeting for the steeplechase. And then later that spring, when we were in the relay circuits, Oklahoma State was really big into relays. So I ran besides the distance medley relay, which I ran indoors, I ran distance medley relay at the Texas relays. I ran another 2:59. When I got to the Drake relays, I ran a 4:08 in the 4-mile relay. I was always the leadoff leg because I was pretty good at being able to keep pace or whatever and keep us close. So I ran 4:08. And then the next day I had another breakthrough race in the steeplechase. I ran 8:51 and came in second. So now I'm ranked in the top 10 nationally in terms of qualifying. To qualify that year for the Olympic trials, you have to run 8:38. I never did run the 8:38. And so my season goes on to the end and I don't keep making dramatic improvements, although I did have pretty significant breakthrough the week before the Big 8 conference outdoors. We were running a dual meet against LSU. And I ran a 4:04.5. I actually surpassed my PR from the indoors by 0.2 of a second. The funny thing was, when I ran 4:04.5, I was a non-scoring fourth place in a dual meet. So I didn't even get a point. And my coach didn't even get my time. It was one of the other assistant coaches from LSU came up and said, "Oh, I got his time, 4:04.5.
That's interesting because I saw that on the Oklahoma State list of top 10 mile times. And I don't know when it's been updated, but you were still number 10.
Yeah.
And it said LSU dual meet. And I was like, what?
Yeah, it was a dual meet. The thing was, it was a dual meet, and LSU had a runner. I can't think of his name right now, but anyway, he was a 402 miler. And so he was pretty competitive. And Johnny Haberstead at that time had not run sub 4, but he'd run 401. And Mike Mankey, who was on my team, who later would go on to run with Athletics West and run 335 in the 1500 meters. He was in that race. So we had a strategy that each one of us would take a different lap. And my lap was to go out and hit 60 seconds for the first, which I did. And then I ended up coming through, I think in 306. So I slowed down similar to the way I did in high school, slowed down the middle 2 laps, and then came back and ran 57 at the end to run 404.5. And then an hour later, I ran my PR in the 3 mile, 14 minutes flat in the 3 mile. But at this point, I'm starting to feel the effects of a long season, but I'm still trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the steeplechase. At that time in that year, my junior year, they did not have the steeplechase in the Big 8 conference. So I was relegated to running the 3 mile. And it was run at altitude. The conference meet was at Boulder. So I didn't fare too well running at altitude. Wasn't my favorite. You're sucking for air when you're running at that altitude. So I didn't do that well in the Big 8 conference. So because of my 851 steeplechase time, I qualified for the NCAAs. So I ended up going to the NCAAs, and I ran a couple other meets. I ran a youth staff meet, and I basically duplicated my time from the Drake relays. I ended up running 852 or something. But I get to the NCAAs. This is my big moment to try to qualify for the Olympic trials. And you have to run prelims just like you do in most big meets. I'm closing on the field, coming off the last water jump. And so and time doesn't matter, it's place. So I'm shooting for the top 6. So I'm in about 7th place. I'm closing on the couple runners in front of me. I trip over the last barrier and I go down hard. This is at Eugene, Oregon. I go down hard, but I spring back up. Hope springs eternal. I sprint it all out. I almost catch the 6th place runner, which would allow me to go into the finals. And I miss it. That race is over. The irony is the guy if I would have passed this guy, he was the guy, Joe Lucas, that goes on to win and runs 8:30 the following day and blows all expectations away. Nobody expected Joe Lucas to win, but he wins the steeplechase that year at 8:30. But I could have ruined his party. I don't think I would have run 8:30, even if in my wildest dreams. But it just shows you the irony sometimes, things that happen in track and field.
Yeah, and we could go back and look at all those twists and turns. If you had a better race in high school, or the guy who beat you hadn't, you might have gone to a different college, had a different, all that stuff.
As a Christian, I definitely believe my faith has always been a strong component of who I am as an individual. It's always caused me to believe that things happen for a reason, that God's not that he causes you to trip and fall. He didn't cause me to trip and fall over that hurdle. But I think had things gone differently, my life would have changed in many ways, not necessarily about track, but just changed. It was important. I went on and ran 2 more races, another ironic race that could have allowed me to qualify was I ran in the Kennedy Games in the steeplechase. This was after the NCAA incident where I didn't make the finals. The officials mismarked the course. I ended up running 8:55 that day, but it was 55 meters too long. So had they measured the course correctly, I wouldn't have run 8:38, but I would have probably for sure run in the mid 8:40s, which would have maybe been enough to get me into the Olympic trials. I found out after the Olympic trials were already over that one of the problems and challenges they had were they set these standards artificially. They said, this is going to be the standard we're going to have to limit the field to, we don't want to have more than 24 runners. But yet they want to have 24 because if they don't have 24 runners, then they can't run prelims and finals or semis, like in the instance of the 1500 meters, 800 meters. They can't run all 3 races if they don't have enough runners. So actually, had I just shown up at the NCAAs in Eugene because of my 8:51, even though it didn't meet the qualifying standard, they'd have allowed me in just to fill up the field.
Yeah.
But I got the t-shirt. In fact, the t-shirt that said 72 Olympic trials. So that was how I met my goal and objective of finishing the top 25 in cross country I came close, but no cigar in terms of making the Olympic trials in the steeplechase. But I had my best season by far. PRs I never surpassed afterwards, even though I ran another year at Oklahoma State.
That was quite a year that Charlie Boatright had in 1972. We'll be back with part 2 in the next episode. Enjoy. Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.